Did you know there is a new law in Washington that will impact homebuyers that goes into effect January 1st, 2024? Well, as of January 2024, buyers and their chosen real estate brokerage and their agent will be required by law to enter into a written brokerage services agreement as soon as reasonably practical. Prior to January 2024, some Washington agents may have chosen to use written agreements with their buyer clients, but it hasn't been required. And if they were used, many times they may have been filled out and signed at the time that the buyer was making their first offer for a home. So why the change? The Northwest MLS, which is my MLS and covers 26 of the 39 counties in Washington state at this time, has been making changes over the last several years to be more transparent with buyers and sellers about agency relationship details. This one is the latest change, and it happens to be statewide law that helps with that transparency. A written agreement has been required when a Washington real estate brokerage lists a seller's home for sale for quite some time. The purpose of the agreement is to lay out expectations and compensation details between the brokerage and the sellers. The same will now apply for buyers. This change is to ensure that buyers, in addition to sellers, understand their chosen firm's representation and the compensation details. A written services agreement between the firm, which is the brokerage, and the principal, which in this case is the buyers, must contain the following: the term or duration of the agreement, the name of the brokers appointed to act as the agent for the buyer, whether the agency relationship is exclusive, which doesn't allow the buyer to enter into an agency relationship with another firm during the term in the same area, or non-exclusive, which does allow the buyer to enter into an agency relationship with multiple firms at the same time in the same area. It needs to state whether the buyer consents to the individual broker or their agent representing both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. This is called limited dual agency. And it also needs to state whether the buyer consents to the broker's designated broker or managing broker acting as a limited dual agent. Those are two different things. It needs to lay out the terms of compensation and whether the buyer wants their agent to show them properties where there is no offer in the listing to help pay the buyer's brokerage compensation. A seller has not been required to offer or pay a buyer's brokerage compensation in the Northwest MLS for several years, but many still do. This part of the agreement lets the buyer determine whether they would want to see homes if there is no offer of compensation in the listing for their buyer brokerage, or if the offer of compensation is lower than what you and your agent agreed upon. Your agent should help you understand the pros and cons to help you make that decision. Lastly, if there are any other agreements between the two parties, then that should be included as well. Something good to know is that once the agreement is signed by both the buyers and their agent, it is possible to amend the agreement if both parties agree. It could be amended to extend the duration or to possibly change one or more of the terms. Sometimes things change as you go along, and you might want to make some adjustments. What does this mean if you plan to buy a home in Washington state going forward, other than the fact that you need a written agreement? Here's a few things you might want to know. When you start discussing buying a home with an agent, we'll need to confirm if you already have a written agreement with any other brokerage in place, and if so, what type of agreement it is. This has technically always been the case, but it will be even more important with the new law since a buyer brokerage services agreement will now be required. We may not be allowed to provide services to you if you already have a written agreement with another brokerage or agent. It depends on the type of the agreement you have. Once you decide to work with a specific agent, you'll need to have a signed written agreement early on in the process. Typically, I will schedule an in-person meeting or a call with the buyer for a consultation to discuss their goals, the home buying process, and to go over the agreement. And at that time, we can talk about what terms they prefer for the written agreement before we move forward. A buyer consultation may take a bit of your time, but it's important so that you meet and get to know your agent, you understand the process and how they work, and you learn what the written agreement is all about. You should also know that you should be provided with a real estate brokerage in Washington pamphlet. It's a 3 or 4 page pamphlet, and you want to read and go over that before you sign any agreement. This pamphlet describes the types of agencies and what you can expect from your agent with each type. As a buyer, you're going to want to be aware of what you are signing and keep copies, either printed or digital, for your reference. You don't want to inadvertently enter into an exclusive agreement for the same area or homes with more than one brokerage or agent, or you might end up owing compensation to more than one. Another thing to be aware of is if you schedule showings online, please read the details of what you're agreeing to. From here on out, you are likely signing some kind of brokerage services agreement just to see that home. So be aware of what you are signing. Is it for a specific home you are scheduling to see, or is it an exclusive agreement for all homes in a specific area, or some other kind of option? You really want to pay attention to what you're agreeing to. I hope this brief video helps give you an idea of what the change is and how it impacts you as a home buyer. It's also good to know about this new law if you are a seller so that you understand how it works for the buyers, and you might also become a buyer yourself. Whether you are a buyer or a seller in Washington State and have questions about this new law, I'm here to help, so please reach out.